Well, over the last few weeks, there's been a tremendous amount of traffic on social media concerning proposed rule changes for the Wildlife Department. So we thought we'd bring in a couple experts and talk about some of those changes and exactly how we got to the point we are now. First, we've got Corey Jager, who is our expert in rulemaking processes, social sciences and things, and we've also got Dallas Barber, our big game biologist. So let's start with you, Corey. Talk a little bit about the different types of rulemaking processes that affect our hunters and anglers.
Sure. So I'll start by saying we have multiple types of laws and rules that kind of guide the boundaries of what our agency does and shouldn't be doing. The first at a higher level is legislative statutes. So we have our own statute at the Oklahoma statute, Title 29, which sets kind of all the major fish and wildlife laws. It says what our commission has the authority to do, gives us our licenses and our license fees, and all of those, because they're legislative, are changed by legislators. Within that, it gives our commission and us a little bit of authority to set rules. So we can do that more on an internal basis. So specifically, the commission's given the authority to create seasons and harvest limits via rules. So those rules are a secondary process. It's an administrative rules process. Ours is Title 800. And that, again, is kind of more of an internal process. Rule changes can be submitted mostly by our biologists, but sometimes constituents have something that they want changed, and they work through our system to get things changed in rules. Typically, the rule change process that we're in right now, it takes about a year. Rule changes are submitted, they're vetted by biologists and our staff. It actually goes to a committee of staff that look at it a little bit more thoroughly, and then they decide whether or not those rules can be submitted to the public for their feedback. So we're in that phase right now. We're in the public comment period where we've submitted, I think, over 30 rule change proposals this go around. Public comment period happens every year, of course, depending on if we have rule change proposals. That public comment period is about 30 days, and it gives the public the opportunity to give us feedback on some of the changes that are being proposed. After comments are collected in February, it's typically our commission takes a look at all those comments, and they decide whether or not they want to approve or disapprove those rule change proposals. If they're approved, they actually go to the legislature for another look. The legislature has the opportunity to approve or disapprove of those rules, then ultimately go to the governor, and if they are approved by all those groups, they become a rule. So everything that's being proposed right now is not going to take effect tomorrow or even in February. They have a lot more process involved, but they could eventually become official rules next fall. So that's kind of where we're at. Another thing to consider within our rules, we give our commission some more finite authority to change some seasons and harvest limits with a resolution. So a resolution is just something that the commission, with the input from the biologists, can change on a little bit more easy basis. Doesn't have to go through the year-long rulemaking cycle, and that's how we set a lot of our antlerless days, set our zones, and that's something they've been doing for quite a long time. So that's kind of the gist of how everything operates.
Okay, good. Now, let's talk about this year's proposals. And specifically, and like Corey said, there's 30 or more that are proposed, but the ones that are getting the most attention are some of the deer regulations. Talk about those specifically.
Yeah, so I mean, like you mentioned, we have quite a few different rule change proposals that are kind of on the table here for this next session. A handful of which apply to our deer seasons, as well as bag limits. So the first one would be that 23-day rifle season kind of extension there. So we're looking at possibly extending our rifle season for another week. And, you know, for the longest time, all of our season dates, bag limits, things like that are all science-based. So all the data that we've compiled really shows that it's not going to make a huge impact on the overall harvest of deer in the state. Most of our data all kind of points to a very large majority of deer being harvested at the beginning of that season, those first kind of handful of days, with some spikes during the weekends, obviously. But from the beginning to the end, it's a pretty good downward trend as far as the number of deer that are harvested over each of those days during that deer season. So the second set, I would say, of proposals are revolving around bag limits, and they're revolving around gunpowder, so to speak. So muzzleloader and rifle. We're taking a look at adding some deer to that bag limit. So currently those bag limits are 2 antlerless deer and 1 antlered deer for each one of those methods of take. We're looking at expanding that to 6. That's not adding a buck to the buck limit. So, you can kind of take your worries there, but just expanding that opportunity for antlerless deer harvest across the antlerless zones of the state. And it's not going to apply to every zone that we have. The state's antlerless herd is managed by those 10 zones that we've drawn out across the state. For instance, southeast Oklahoma, probably not going to get an expansion if this proposal does go through, just because the population there is still fairly small and doesn't need that additional antlerless harvest. But you look at some other antlerless zones, and it's something that definitely needs to be taken into consideration.
That's good. And I've heard it explained, comparing it to like a speed limit that's set for the state. It doesn't mean that every single road in the state gets that new bump up in speed limit. It just means that would be the maximum allowed at any one place.
Exactly.
And where appropriate, the speed limit would be much less.
Exactly.
Good deal. Okay, so what is the overall theme of these deer changes?
Yeah, so over the last handful of years, since about 2014, we've really started to see a decline in antlerless harvest. 2014, we were right up around 40%. The last handful of years, we've dropped down to kind of 36% right in there. So even though we're talking about a small percentage change when you're looking at the grand picture of things, 4% of 110,000 can be quite a few animals that we're lacking as far as harvest goes. So all of these proposals are really built to up our antlerless harvest.
That's good. Now, the majority of Oklahoma's land is privately owned, but we still have a tremendous amount of constituencies that hunts on public land.
Yes.
How could these changes affect public land management?
So each one of our WMAs, or wildlife management areas, are managed individually. They each have their own set of regulations that occur in Title 800. So for us to change anything like that, we would have to go in and individually change every single one of those, which is not something that we're looking at currently doing. For one reason being that those areas just can't handle that much pressure. You're talking about a very small percentage of our land makeup, and currently they already make up quite a bit of harvest. The last handful of years, we've averaged about 6% of our total harvest just off of that 3% of land mass in the state. So it's a very important piece of property to our hunters, but we just don't think that it could handle the additional pressure.
Okay. Now, Corey, let's talk a little bit about managing hunters themselves. We have the science for managing the resource, but people management is a critical part of what we do too.
It is. So one thing that it's been very important for our agency is to look at that human component of what we do. So we actually have one dedicated staff person looking at all the social science. It is just a science just as much as biological science, and so we take those two things hand in hand to make our decisions. And so how we do that is often through surveys. We have an annual hunter survey, so on occasions like this, we may ask questions about whether or not hunters support or oppose different regulation changes, but we ultimately also get information on participation in different seasons, harvest rates of animals that aren't e-checked. So we know quite a bit about what hunters may or may not do. In this case, as Dallas mentioned, a lot of the harvest during deer gun season is during those first few days, if not first week. From our surveys, we know hunters only spend about 6 days of field during gun season. So an additional week would, of course, give more opportunity for hunters, but it doesn't necessarily mean people are going to take advantage of it. We don't know how many people would take advantage of it, but it is added opportunity for them to fill those bags if they choose. On the flip side, there's also different groups of people that we have to consider in terms of these rule changes. So a lot of the focus has been deer gun hunters and the additional opportunity for them. But in a decision like this, we have to think about the other hunters that this might impact. It may be a perception, it may be reality, but there's other hunters that are afield during those additional 7 days. We've got bow hunters, squirrel hunters, trappers, all those other people that may have concerns about deer hunters still being afield pursuing deer. And so those are the things that we have to weigh in addition to the public comments when we're looking at making this major rule change.
Okay, so speaking of public comments, we have entered into that period of the annual schedule, like you mentioned. How can people physically, comment?
Sure, that's a good question. So the easiest way is to go on our website, wildlifedepartment.com. On the main homepage, there's a button for public comment. That's got all the information on everything that's going on this rule change cycle. So there's an agenda that kind of summarizes each of the rule changes that we're proposing, because as we mentioned earlier, there's actually over 30, I believe, rule change proposals this year, not just the 2 deer ones. So there may be other things that impact people that they might be interested in. On that page, you also are given 3 different opportunities for how you want to comment. We have a form that you can just comment right online on any of the rule change proposals that you're interested in. That's, of course, the easiest way. Anybody can do it from wherever you are. But you can also attend one of 2 public hearings. Those are in-person public meetings, essentially. Those are both on January 2nd. One's in Oklahoma City at our main office, and then one's in Broken Bow, and they both start at 7 p.m. Of course, if you come to the public meeting or you comment online, it makes no difference. All those comments are compiled for our commissioners at the end. But if you prefer to comment in person, that's perfectly fine. And then in addition to that, you're always welcome to submit a letter, mail it in, and we'll accept that as comment as well. So there's a lot of different ways to have your voice heard, and our commissioners have to read every single comment before they make a decision on those rule change proposals, and so it's a good opportunity to have input in the process.
Well, that's excellent. We hope that this may have cleared up some confusion that might be out there, some misperceptions of what these regulations really do affect. And we just would encourage you to, just like Corey has said, to participate in the process and make a comment.